Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. We're talking with Dan Barry. We're talking about growing up Catholic, growing up in the suburbs, growing up Irish, epiphanies about life. This is our second conversation with Dan Barry. This is Dan Barry's life. Pull me up. Now, Dan, the title of the book is drawn from your mother's words to you. Pull me up. Mm-hmm. Talk about your mom.
She was born in Galway, County Galway in Ireland. You know, in the late 30s and early 40s, Ireland was the third world country, and into the 50s. And they had it tough. Her mother died when she was 10. Her father died when she was 15. And this is a common custom to pack the kid up and send him or her to the States. And she was sent to a far-off place called Brooklyn, New York, where an aunt would immediately put her to work in servitude, you know, basically cleaning the house and everything. And she met my father at a church dance in Brooklyn. And within 10 years of leaving Ireland as an orphan farm girl, she's living in Deer Park, Long Island, and she's a suburban housewife, a counterintuitive kind of housewife.
Right.
And
explain this counterintuitive housewife.
Well,
give me some visual images. I've got pictures of your mother.
Sure, sure. One thing she would do is we didn't sit around and listen. We listened to a lot of the Clancy brothers. You know, that we listened to, the rebel songs and the drinking songs. And so when I was a little kid, you know, I'm singing these songs celebrating, you know, Puccin and Krishkinlan, and, you know, let's knock a few back. And if I'm not singing about that, I'm singing about going to war with Britain. And if I'm not singing about that, it's about returning to the clay, you know, dying. So that's the music of our life in a way. My mother would listen to Johnny Cash. She was a devoted Johnny Cash fan, specifically the live albums from Folsom Prison and San Quentin Prison. And so she would vacuum the house, singing, I took a shot of cocaine, then I shot my woman down. I shot her down and I went to bed. I stuck that little 44 beneath my head. So here's my mother from Ireland vacuuming, and she would work up such a sweat listening to him singing to a bunch of inmates in Folsom that the house would be redolent of lemon pledge when she was done. The place would be spotless.
What was the attraction?
I don't know. I honestly, God, I don't know. But one is that Johnny Cash was a genius. I don't know. I think that there was something about being on the other side, being an outsider in. She was like that. And
I see her in a pail of cigarette smoke, just this blue haze here.
Yeah, and so she would sit in the living room on the couch, okay, and she had a special place. Merv Griffin would be on TV, and he'd be interviewing Paul Anka, but the sound would be off, okay, because my mother would be telling stories, either about Ireland or about her experiences at work, or just about what the neighbors were doing, what this wacko neighbor did and what this wacko neighbor said. And she would spin these wonderful stories out of really nothing, but they meant something to us. So she'd be sitting in the living room couch, and the dryer would be, you know, kicking and swinging out of balance, and the dogs, we had 3 dogs, and they'd be, you know, breathing loudly as they slept. My father would be upstairs howling from the cluster migraines. So this is where she ruled the roost. She heard everything. So then she was diagnosed with cancer, and she would not go to the hospital, did not want a hospital bed, and so she died on that couch, okay? And so one night, as she was, you know, in the last few weeks, the 4 Barry children would take turns sleeping on the floor next to the couch in case she needed something. And one night, she was heavily medicated, and she had the sensation of falling. That's what happens sometimes with this medication. It's like morphine. And she woke up and started saying, "Pull me up, Danny, Danny, pull me up, pull me up." And I said, "You know, I have you, Mom, I have you, don't worry, I have you." And so the pull me up, to me, it said something. I don't know, that we all need to be pulled up.
Yeah, and it seems that within several months of her dying, you were diagnosed with a virulent form of tracheal cancer. Right. And in a sense, you, in this book, are pulling yourself up and being pulled up. Talk about the horrible moments of your illness when you come to realize that this is you.
My mother had just died, so I'd seen the ravages of the disease through my mother, and there's nothing more difficult except through a child, I suppose. And I had an 18-month-old daughter. I was the City Hall bureau chief, covering someone you might remember, Rudolph W. Giuliani.
We're going to talk about one of your favorite
And it was a blow because they weren't saying nice things. And so I spent a lot of time at Memorial Sloan Kettering, which is a wonderful, wonderful hospital. It's a very forbidding place, though, for the people in there are incredibly dedicated. I spent a lot of time there. And those are the experiences that you remember, being attached to an IV pole for several days at a time, and it becomes your partner. And I compare it to, my Ginger. I'm Fred, my Ginger, and wandering around with this IV pole, and it would squeak, and if ever the IV solution went out of balance, it would beep like a truck backing up. And sometimes in the morning, I would go downstairs and try to make believe that I wasn't a patient.
Right.
I would never wear the Johnnies. I always wore my own clothes, even though if I would never, I felt that was submitting. That was my own
You weren't
thing.
giving in.
Right. I mean, it's a minor psychological victory, I suppose, but it meant something to me. And so then in the mornings, you're kind of woozy from the chemotherapy. You're in a hospital. There's the faint sense of nausea always around you. But I would go downstairs in the morning with my IV pole, dressed, and go to a little Starbucks stand that they had and get a coffee and a donut and sit there and read the Daily News and the Times and the Post and make believe that I wasn't a patient.
But you've got the IV pole connected to you.
And when you're in the elevator and you're the one with the IV pole and there are 4 other people, they're all looking at you saying,
Right.
I wonder what kind he has. You can hear them. And this is how you think, and late nights getting IV, blood transfusions. And my father was a big horror movie buff and an Abbott and Costello buff and, all this kind of old movies.
Well, this is one of the cause of your life, Abbott and Costello, Laurel and Hardy.
Yeah, exactly. And so I was getting a blood transfusion one night, and it was taking an awfully long time, and finally the nurse made a mistake, and the blood went flying, and it went under my pants. And instead of thinking about, oh, wow, someone else's blood on my pants, I immediately started thinking about these old Universal horror movies, The Wolfman and Dracula and Maria Uspinskaya, and how my father would do this great Maria Uspinskaya imitation. She's the one who said the mark of the pentagram, the Wolfman and all this kind of stuff. And then I would remember, that's behind me, and this is what I risk losing if I don't make it through this.
Yeah, what keeps you going? I mean, clearly your wife keeps you going.
A lot of
your
medication.
Daughter, a lot of medication keeps you going.
Yeah.
Is there was there a mantra? What just kept you moving one foot in front of another?
The mantra was an expletive. I'm not making this up. The mantra was an expletive addressed to the disease.
Go ahead.
I want to say, fuck you, fuck this, fuck this. And that's what I would do. When I was shooting baskets, I would alternate between saying, fuck this, and
anger,
and
right.
God, God, help me here. I got a wife and I got a kid. You got to help me. I'll hit 10 foul shots.
Negotiating with God again.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I don't think that's what they teach you in seminaries, to negotiate with God that way, but I did.
And God, did God respond in the appropriate way?
I hope so. I think so. I don't think he's ever had a basketball presented to him as a rosary bead, but I think so. It's a continuing battle, though.
Talk about your courtship and wedding. I was thrilled to see that you got married in Our Lady of Sorrows church. I spent my first years of teaching at Our Lady of Sorrows. Talk about your courtship. And the reaction of your in-laws on the wedding day I thought was particularly appropriate, that you had finally done it.
Yeah, I met my wife at St. Bonaventure University, and what had happened was I was in a bar shooting pool, drinking beer, and she walked in and she ordered a 7 and 7. And I thought that was the most sophisticated thing
cool.
I'd ever heard. She wasn't ordering a shot and a beer. She was ordering a 7 and 7.
Classic.
Whoa. And I said to her, hey, I got a quarter up on the pool table. You want to play? And what she said? She said, yes. So we played pool. The first date
This opening line's not going to work with everybody.
No, I know. I was lucky that day. Our first date was to go see that romantic flick, Apocalypse Now. which
Ooh,
was very nice.
Very nice, very nice.
Brando really did it for me. So, and so we dated. It was kind of an Irish courtship. You know, it took a long time, and so we finally get married.
Very long time.
Very long time.
Tell us how long.
12 years.
Okay.
But okay, let's moving on. But in 1990, you know, we have the videographer and they're filming Mary coming out of the house and everything, and they just happen to pick her mother saying, "Well, slow-moving Dan finally did it." And it's picked up on the camera, you know, in the video. So. And it was at Our Lady of Sorrows, which was nice.
Did it capture the essence of your mother-in-law's comment at the time, that it took you that long?
Yeah, I suppose so. It was like I was kind of ambling along and, you know, I said, oh my God, look at what time it is, you know.
What made you decide that, you know, 12 years was enough?
You know, probably 6 years was enough, probably 5, probably 2. But I realized, you know, this is who I want to spend the rest of my life with. And I had known it years earlier, I suppose, but it took me that long.
And you have two
I was following the story. I was looking for stories.
Well, that would be it. You have 2 daughters.
I do, yeah.
And your daughter Nora was born first, and then you mentioned at the end, you know, your daughter Grace, but she's not a major character in this
No,
work.
she's in the acknowledgments.
Right.
And the reason is that the book's chronology ends in April of 2000 after I've gotten a clean CAT scan. My wife and Nora and I go to Ireland to where my mother was from, and we just kind of breathe in the fresh, different, non-hospital air. And then Grace is born two and a half years later.
Now, talk about your first daughter. You went through trauma in terms of adoption, and again, it struck me very personally because my sister-in-law did almost the exact same thing you did and got her daughter in Texas as well. Talk about your experience, your yearning for children, your inability to have children, and then the several awful events that occurred before you finally... And then talk about Nora and her birth.
Well, we decided to adopt a child, and we went through a service in Texas. And as is the case oftentimes, there were a few false starts. Anyone who has gone through the adoption process knows the pain of that. And one time, a birth mother told us that she wanted to meet us. And so we flew to Dallas, rented a car, drove to Wichita Falls, which is in the middle of nowhere. And the woman had changed her mind, God bless her. She was only about 21 or so. And she eluded us for 4 days.
I know, she
in
kept putting you
Wichita
off.
Falls, Texas. And then it was time for us to return to New York, and there was nothing we could do. I made one last phone call from a supermarket, and she wasn't available, and I just told the woman who answered that Mary and Dan wish her well. But we were heartbroken. And then the second time, we sent money to a birth mother, and they ran off with it. They disappeared. And then the last time, we went to San Antonio. And they tell you in the adoption service business that all the strife that you go through beforehand will be forgotten the moment you hold the baby. You will forget about all the money, and you will forget about all the months and months of agony. And we were there for Nora's birth, and the moment we held Nora, the moment I held Nora, I knew, I thought they were selling me a line. I'm here to tell you, as soon as you hold the baby, I forgot all of those things. And it was only in writing the book that I said, oh, do you remember that woman who ripped us off of $2 or $3 grand? I'd forgotten her because I had Nora.
Right. Now, was Grace, your wife gave birth to Grace? So
No,
this
Grace,
was another
Grace is adopted as well.
child
She's from
as well.
Hornell, New York, which is upstate in the southern tier.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, if you were going to add to the book, what chapters might you add? As you said, you stopped the chronology, 4 years ago?
In April of 2000.
Okay, more than 4 years ago. What are the next chapters in this book?
I think that, well, Grace, you could argue that Grace would be a chapter. I mean, but in terms of my career, the only thing that would come to mind would be 9/11. Like any reporter and like any person living in the New York metropolitan area, that consumed me, and it consumed me and many people at the times for months and months and months and months. And the experiences that I had meeting the people who had lost people and going down to the site in the early days and returning over and over and over again. I don't think, I think it's very common. It's almost mundane for people in the New York area. Oh yeah, Ground Zero. But I have an approach that says, this is not acceptable, this is not normal. You cannot blow a hole in the bottom of Manhattan and then have life go on. And so I think the psychological repercussions are continuing for years and years afterward. And that's why in the column now, which I only began about a year and a half ago, I come back to, some people would say, all right, 9/11, we got it. Well, I don't get it. I still don't get it. And I have to go back and see the weird little ways, the weird little ripples in our lives.
Okay, let's talk about the Times and your About New York column and your experience as the City Hall bureau chief. Last week we talked about your first contact with the Times, and it happened to have been with someone spilling beer on you for your first interview.
And I didn't get the job.
And you didn't get the job.
No.
Let's now talk about. Let's talk, though, a little bit about the Providence Journal, where you won your investigative awards. And let's go to the Times, and then let's talk about the column and Rudy Giuliani. Talk about your career as a journalist, because something that's in here and in your columns is you love the words, you love the language, and it probably comes from your background. There were many times where, in this earmarked book, where I just have exclamation points of great phraseology and just sort of pithy expression. Talk about your days in the newsroom. You said ink was sacred, you could smell it. Talk about it.
Well, when I got a job at the Journal-Enquirer in Manchester, Connecticut, it's in an industrial park. It's a squat one-story building. When you walk in, you can smell the press. You can see, the building actually shakes when the presses are running. It still is that kind of a newspaper. And when you walk in, the place smells of ink. And I remember, being 23 or 24 and walking in there and saying, "Mama, I'm home." There was something about it.
You knew right away that this was it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I knew. I knew that, the police scanner was going, and people were typing, and there was just an urgency to everything, and there was a challenge every day to try and evoke Dylan Thomas, even though you're writing about a planning and zoning commission meeting.
Right.
And that was the challenge, and that was the glory of it. And every once in a while there'd be something exciting, a murder. It's weird as a newspaper reporter. As a human being, you don't want anyone murdered. As a newspaper reporter, once it happens, it's a story. Who was this person? Who killed them? And what were the circumstances? I don't think that's particularly healthy, but it's necessary.
But that's true of reporters. I was shocked. I do commentary at WABC, and Cheryl Fiandaca, who was our legal reporter, very fine woman, was very glum one day in a cubicle. And I said, "What's the matter, Cheryl?" She said, "I need a good kidnapping or a good killing."
I know.
And you said the same thing. And then as we talked about last week, your eyes were open with one of your colleagues was killed.
Right, and that turned the tables a little bit on me and us, I think. And I think that I've approached that ever since differently. And I think that in the aftermath of 9/11, I didn't enjoy one moment, and I do not enjoy one moment of that. Rather, I think everyone at the Times felt an obligation. It was like a responsibility to record what had happened and to hear these people's stories. And when I talk to classes, I was just at St. Bonaventure last week. It's 3 years later, and I was telling a story about the dust that covered the buildings around Ground Zero site. And I walked around and wrote down what people had written in the dust.
Wow.
And I can't even talk about it because when I talk about it in public, I begin to get emotional.
Oh, yeah, no, I've got goosebumps because I remember
later.
being down there. And Baruch, where I teach, is right near the Armory, and that's where the location was. And all the photos, I mean, it's still extraordinarily. Let's stick with that. On a recent column, this September 11th, you wrote a column, September 11th, yet nothing stops the tides. And you place yourself probably at the far end from the World Trade Center up in Orchard Beach.
City Island.
City Island, right.
Right. Well, it was the third anniversary, and it's interesting how we think. The first anniversary is monumental.
Right.
But there's something in society that says, all right, after 1 year, okay, stop your grieving, stop your mourning, move on with your life. That's nonsense. We all grieve in our own rhythm, and it's not set by the calendar. The second anniversary, I wrote about the Petrocelli family in Staten Island. Their son was killed in the event. They're lovely, lovely people. They lost their son, and he returns to them in bits and pieces. Every once in a while, they get a call from the medical examiner's office saying we found another piece of mark. And as they're telling me this, we're sitting at their dining room table, And they're lovely people. They had coffee and desserts out for us, and they're telling us this the photographer and I, they're telling us this heart-rending story. And Al, the father, says, and he would sit where you're sitting. He would sit here at the dinner table. And I used that exact quote. Some people would think of it as a throwaway line or something, but in fact, where you're sitting, to put the reader at that table, all of New York knows that feeling, all of much of New Jersey and Connecticut. So then the third anniversary comes. Well, how are we supposed to feel? Well, you know, some of us still feel bad, but there's something about the third anniversary that wanted me to be near water. And I looked all over New York to find out where would I go to just be near water on the third anniversary, because there's something cleansing about water, there's something cathartic, there's something that carries us away. And I went to City Island and went to a marina, and I just asked a guy, what are you doing tomorrow, which was the 11th. And he had a plan to be on his boat, and there was something, to me, wonderful about that. He had been deeply affected by it. In fact, the day it happened, and that's another thing about it, City Island seems very far away, but in fact, all of New York is very close. All he had to do was go down a little bit in his boat that day, and he could see the smoke rising from Lower Manhattan. So we're all connected that way. That's why I did City Island for September 11th on the third anniversary.
Yeah, it was very powerful. Let's continue talking about your About New York column. How do you write the pieces? How do you decide the pieces? What do you mentioned earlier, sometimes you begin the story and you don't know how it's going to end. Talk about how you write the column.
The mandate really is anything within the 5 boroughs. And so Clyde Haberman does, his piece, it's more of a man, speaking on the issues of the day. Joyce Pernick does more political stuff.
Right.
My mandate, which was formed by Meyer Berger back in the early 50s, is just to find little stories in New York that illuminate New York. And so people who have inherited that column over the years, some would be more political, some would be specifically off the news. Bill Geist, very funny guy, would go for humor more often than not. I think, because of my experience in City Hall and whatever, sometimes I'm funny, sometimes I'm looking to bust chops, sometimes I'm just trying to reflect the way the city is.
Yeah,
and I find the extraordinary in the ordinary moments. So the Daily News has a photograph of a guy who caught a baby that was thrown from the roof of a building in Brooklyn when there was a fire, right? But it was only about 100 words. I said, let me go and talk to that guy and slow it down and ask, what does it feel like to catch a baby? And there's a whole backstory to the guy. He'd worked all night, and he's eating a sub, he's watching ESPN. You know what he does? He's the guy that cleans the buildings in Lower Manhattan when everyone else leaves. He's going in at 5 o'clock when everyone goes out. He cleans the toilets. Then he goes and he has his sub and he watches ESPN. The house across the street's on fire. He runs out. There's a woman. She won't let go of the baby. She's afraid to throw the baby. And he finally convinces her, and she throws the baby. And I stop it right there.
What trust
and I say,
and hopelessness.
Who did she throw it to?
Right.
Who is this guy?
This
and
is
it turns
good.
out, and
I didn't read this one. This is a good one.
It turns out that he tells me, yeah, I've played a lot of semi-pro football. He plays for the Queens Brooklyn League. And these guys, maybe they're not good enough to be in the NFL. They're better than you and me.
Good hands.
You
need good hands.
I said to him, what would you play, offense or defense? And he said both. And I said to him, do you have good hands? And he said, I have very good hands.
You're not kidding. It saved the baby.
And then, boom.
Wow.
Catches the baby.
Wow.
It's unbelievable.
Before you did the About New York column, you were the Times' City Hall bureau chief, and the guy that you covered was Rudy Giuliani. In the last couple of minutes that we have, at least begin talking about Rudy. You're Dan Barry looking at Rudy.
Well, first of all, I was very fortunate because he's never boring. I mean, that's the thing about it. From a newspaper reporter's point of view and working in Room 9 in City Hall, there's always something going on. He's somehow Winnie the Pooh is a part of the news one day, where he's picking on the Brooklyn Museum. There was always something going on.
Oh, he's always fighting.
Right. And so when I began at the start of his second term, he was on his civility kick. And that really struck me, the idea that a man could think of instilling civility in a city of 8 million and also suggesting that there wasn't already civility. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
That in fact, this city works pretty darn well without having a list of do's and don'ts that are beyond what are in the books, in the law books.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And so I thought that was, quite a man.
Yeah, but coming from your Catholic background and understanding from my Catholic background, you can almost understand that he was almost the chief nun in charge of the city at one point. You know, you had to be polite, you had to be
Right.
civil. What was the best story that you did on Rudy Giuliani? The story that you sort of look back on and say, this either captured Giuliani or captured me at that moment?
Two. One, on the civility thing, I described him as being the father in the station wagon, looking in the rearview mirror, and he's looking at 8 million passengers in the back of the station wagon, and he's threatening to pull over if we don't all behave.
Right. Okay,
Right,
good.
But secondly, his struggle following the Avenue Louima and the Patrick Dorismond cases and Diallo, an appalling inability to connect with people of color in the city. And when Virginia Fields called him, Virginia Fields and Carl McCall, he may not have liked them and may not have agreed with them, but they were never up to City Hall, never met with them, never heard what they were saying. So then when there's the fallout from one of these brutal incidents, suddenly
Right.
he's going to talk to
Right.
Virginia Fields. To me, that said, you know, he had many great accomplishments, but that was an appalling mark against him in the 8 years that he was the mayor of the city.
30 seconds, Mike Bloomberg.
You know, I think he's an interesting guy. I think he's doing better than we thought he would. I think he can be pretty prickly at times, too quickly. Too quickly is he prickly. For example, the stadium thing that he's casting his lot with, I haven't figured that out yet. I don't know why we have to build the stadium or commit to the stadium before we know whether we're going to have the Olympics. That's all I know.
Okay. Pleasure. We
Well,
really
thanks
have
for having
another
me.
half hour, but
No.
we've got to stop.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Thank you.